Ever wondered how dynamic server responses are generated? Well, it's a fascinating process that sits at the heart of web development, enabling personalized, interactive, and data-driven user experiences. Dynamic server responses are essentially the customized content of HTTP responses that a server dynamically creates based on various factors. These could include user input, database queries, session data, or even external APIs. The power to generate these responses comes from server-side programming languages. These languages, like Java, Python, Node.js, and PHP, execute on the server and dynamically generate HTML, JSON, XML, or other types of responses based on request parameters and application logic. The beauty of dynamic server responses lies in their ability to cater to the specific needs of each client or user, making web applications more interactive and user-friendly. So let's dive into how these dynamic server responses are actually generated. The journey of a dynamic server response starts with server-side processing. This is where the magic happens, where code written in server-side programming languages like Java, Python, Node.js, or PHP springs into action. These languages help the server understand the client's request, and they're the driving force behind generating the dynamic responses we interact with on the web every day. Now you might be wondering, what exactly does server-side processing mean? Well, when an HTTP request hits the server-side code executes, doing its job right on the server. It's like a chef in a kitchen, taking in orders, preparing the dish, and serving it up, all behind the scenes. This code is responsible for generating HTML, JSON, XML, or other types of responses dynamically. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. No, the server-side code is smart. It tailors the response based on the request parameters and the specific logic of the application. Let's take an example. Imagine you're browsing an e-commerce site. You click on a product category, say books. This action sends an HTTP request to the server. The server-side code, being the diligent chef it is, takes this order, understands that you want to see books, and gets to work. It prepares an HTML response that includes all the books available, each with its own details like title, author, price, and so on. And voila! You see a page full of books ready for you to explore. But server-side processing doesn't stop there. It's also responsible for data validation, authentication, authorization, and execution of business logic. It ensures the data is safe and sound, that the person making the request has the right to do so, and that everything aligns with the rules and logic set by the application. In essence, server-side processing is the cornerstone of dynamic server responses. It's the unseen force that takes client requests, processes them, and delivers personalized, interactive responses that create the web experiences we know and love. Now that we understand server-side processing, how does the server know what the client wants? Well, stay tuned, because that's what we're diving into next. The server understands the client's intent through a process called request processing. So let's dive right into it. When the server receives an HTTP request from a client, which could be a web browser or another application, it needs to interpret what this request is asking for. This involves parsing various elements of the request. These elements include headers, which provide context about the request, URL parameters, which can specify certain operations or identify resources, form data, which could contain user inputs, and cookies, which can give information about the client's previous interactions. Now, this is where it gets interesting. The server doesn't just blindly accept these requests. It performs data validation to ensure that the request data meets certain criteria. This could be as simple as checking if a form field isn't left empty, or as complex as validating a user's credentials against a database. Speaking of credentials, this brings us to authentication. Authentication is the process of verifying the identity of the client. This could involve checking a username and password, validating a token, or even biometric verification. Once the client's identity is confirmed, we move on to authorization. Authorization determines what actions the authenticated client is allowed to perform. This could involve checking user roles, permissions, or access levels. Now we've authenticated, authorized, and validated the data. What's next? Well, it's time to execute some business logic. This is where the server-side code starts to do its thing, processing the data, making calculations, or making decisions based on the request parameters. But what if there's an error, you might ask? Well, that's a good point. Throughout this process, the server must handle any errors that occur, whether they're due to invalid data, failed authentication, lack of authorization, or problems executing the business logic. Proper error handling not only helps to maintain the stability and security of the application, but it also provides useful feedback to the client about what went wrong. Once the server understands the client's request, it's time to get the necessary data. Data retrieval and manipulation is the next step in generating dynamic server responses. Now imagine your server-side code as a master chef. This chef, based on the request received, understands what dish to prepare. But to make this dish, our chef needs ingredients. That's where databases, file systems, external APIs, or other data sources come into play. These are the storage houses from where our chef collects the necessary ingredients, or in our case, the data. Much like a chef selects only the freshest vegetables or the choicest cuts of meat, the server-side code cherry-picks the data it needs. It could be a simple retrieval or a complex query involving multiple tables, joins, and conditions. And it's not limited to databases alone. It might interact with file systems to fetch or store files, call external APIs for additional data, or use other data sources as required. Once our chef has the ingredients, it's time to prepare the dish. Similarly, the server-side code manipulates and processes the data as needed. It could involve transforming the data into a more suitable format, filtering out unnecessary details, sorting or grouping the data based on certain criteria. This manipulation is guided by the application logic, the same way a recipe guides a chef. Think of it like this. If the request was for a salad, our chef would fetch fresh vegetables, chop them into bite-sized pieces, mix them in a certain order, and then add dressing and seasoning. In our server-side code, fetching the fresh vegetables equates to retrieving the necessary data from the database. Chopping them into bite-sized pieces is akin to transforming and filtering the data. Mixing in a certain order and adding dressing and seasoning is the application logic, which determines how the data is processed and manipulated. With all the ingredients prepped and ready, our chef is ready to serve the dish. Similarly, with the necessary data at hand, processed and prepared as per the request and application logic, we're ready for the next step. With the necessary data at hand, it's time to generate the response. The final steps in generating a dynamic server response are response generation and sending the response. Once the necessary data has been processed and prepared, the server-side code gets to work, crafting the dynamic content of the HTTP response. You might be wondering, how is this done? Well, it's not as complicated as it may sound. For HTML-based responses, server-side templates come into play. These templates, like JSP in Java, Django templates in Python, or EJS in Node.js, combine static markup with dynamic data. Think of it as a recipe where the static markup is your list of ingredients, and the dynamic data is the secret sauce that gives it flavor. This combination allows for the generation of dynamic web pages that are unique to each user or situation. But what about JSON-based responses? For these, the server-side code serializes data structures into JSON format. This process transforms complex data structures into a format that can be easily transmitted and understood by both the server and the client. Libraries or built-in language features are often used to make this serialization process a breeze. Now, with the response dynamically generated, it's time for it to embark on its journey back to the client. The server sends the response over the established HTTP connection. This response includes several important elements. Firstly, it includes an HTTP status code, which indicates the outcome of the request. This could be 200 for success, 404 for not found, or 500 if there's a server error. Next are the response headers, which might include information like the content type. And finally, the response body houses the dynamic content that has been so carefully crafted. As an example, in a Java web application using Servlets and JSP, the servlet receives the HTTP request, processes it, interacts with the database, and executes the necessary business logic. It then forwards the request to a JSP page, which combines HTML markup with dynamic data to generate the dynamic HTML content. The servlet then sends this dynamically generated HTML response back to the client, ready to be rendered in the web browser. And that, in a nutshell, is how dynamic server responses are generated. Generating dynamic server responses is a fundamental part of web development. It's a process that starts with server-side processing, where languages like Java, Python, or Node.js come into play. As a request is received, it's parsed and processed, taking into account various factors like headers, URL parameters, and cookies. Then comes the data retrieval and manipulation stage, where we interact with databases, APIs, or other data sources to satisfy the client's request. Once we have the necessary data, we move on to generating the actual response. Here, we may use server-side templates for HTML-based responses or serialize data structures into JSON format. Finally, we send the response back to the client, complete with an HTTP status code and the dynamic content in the response body. With a grasp of these concepts, you're well on your way to understanding the magic behind dynamic web applications. Keep exploring, keep learning.